At 6:04 on the morning of the 14th of August 1991, a Royal Navy Lynx helicopter began its final approach to the helipad at Bessbrook Mill, 4 miles northwest of Newry in South Armagh. The mill had been built in 1845 for the production of linen. It had been disused since 1971. In the 18 years since the British Army had taken it over, it had become the operational forward base for 22 SAS, 14 Intelligence Company, the Special Forces Support Group, the Joint Helicopter Command Unit, and the Force Research Unit's South Armagh detachment. By August 1991, it was running more helicopter sorties per week than any other military base in Europe. More than Wildenrath, more than Goose Bay, more than the Brigade Aviation hub at Aldergrove. The reason was simple. Every road into South Armagh belonged to the IRA. The only way in and out of Bandit Country was the air. The figure in the parliamentary record is 600 flights a week, 15,000 passengers a month. At its peak, the years between 1988 and 1996, the helipad inside the perimeter of an 1845 linen mill in a Quaker model village in County Armagh handled more rotary movement than the North Sea oil platforms. It handled more rotary movement than any installation on the European mainland. And it did so because, by the standards of late 20th century British military doctrine, South Armagh had ceased to be a place a uniformed soldier could enter on foot or in a vehicle and reasonably expect to come out again. This is the story of how that came to be. It is the story of a disused linen mill in a Quaker village, whose founder, John Grubb Richardson, decreed that there should be no pawn shop and no public house within its boundaries. It is the story of the men who lived inside its wire for 37 years. It is the story of the men who watched it from across the wire for almost as long. And it is the story of the morning of the 25th of June 2007. When 20 soldiers of the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment walked out of the gate at 9 o'clock and locked it behind them. To understand Bessbrook Mill, you have to begin with the ground. South Armagh, as it would later be called in every secret intelligence assessment crossing the desk of the Chief of the General Staff, is a triangle of roughly 200 square miles, bounded by the city of Newry to the east, the international border with the Republic to the south and west, and the line of the Belfast-Dublin Railway to the north. Inside that triangle sit the villages of Crossmaglen, Forkhill, Newtown Hamilton, Cullyhanna, Jonesborough and Drummintee. Inside that triangle, in the early 1970s, sat the 2nd Battalion of the South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional Irish Republican Army. And inside that triangle, by the autumn of 1975, the British Army had come to a conclusion that, in the official histories, has never been printed in plain English. The conclusion was this: the British Army could no longer move on the roads. The decision, when it came after a specific incident. On the 9th of October 1975, an Army Saracen armoured personnel carrier, a 6-wheeled, fully enclosed vehicle weighing 10.5 tons and designed in the 1950s to survive small arms fire, was driving along a road outside Crossmaglen. A culvert device, command detonated from across the border, lifted the Saracen off the road, broke it into 3 sections and took down 3 soldiers inside it. The South Armagh Brigade had spent the previous 4 years perfecting the culvert charge. The Saracen was the largest target they had ever brought down. After the Saracen, the order came down through Lisburn that the road network in South Armagh was no longer to be used for routine military movement. By the end of 1976, no British soldier travelled by road into South Armagh. None. The army had given up the ground. The decision created a problem. The Army still had to garrison the 3 joint Army RUC bases at Crossmaglen, at Fork Hill and at Newtown Hamilton. Those bases still had to be fed, watered, manned, relieved and resupplied. Their casualties still had to be flown out. Their rubbish still had to be carried away. If none of it could move on the roads, all of it had to move through the air. And all of it needed a single hub. The hub became Bessbrook. The mill had been requisitioned in 1970. It sat on a flat triangle of ground at the western edge of the village, with a Quaker meeting house on one side and the old mill manager's house on the other. The linen industry had quit Bessbrook half a generation earlier. The roof leaked. The looms were gone. The Royal Engineers came in during 1972 and began the long job of turning a Victorian textile factory into a fortified forward operating base. They built the perimeter walls, 3 metres of reinforced concrete topped with mesh and razor wire. They built 4 Sangar watchtowers at the corners, each manned 24 hours a day by 2 soldiers behind layered glass. They poured the Helipad. By the end of 1973, 1 Wessex could land at a time. By 1976, the Helipad had been expanded to take 4 aircraft. By the late 1980s, the rotary tempo at Bessbrook was the highest in Western Europe. Inside the wire, the institutional geography settled into a pattern that would hold for 30 years. The old mill building itself, the long red brick 3-storey block that gave Bessbrook its skyline, became the operations centre. The mill manager's house, a smaller stone building set apart at the western end of the compound, became the officers' accommodation. The newer outbuildings were divided up. 1 block went to the Resident Infantry Battalion, which rotated every 6 months. 1 block went to the Resident SAS Troop, which rotated every 6 weeks. 1 annex went to a detachment of 14 Intelligence Company, the surveillance unit that had been formed in 1973 and whose existence the British government would not officially acknowledge until the 1990s. 1 annex, from 1980 onwards, went to a detachment of the Force Research Unit, whose existence the British government has, in important particulars, still not officially acknowledged. The rest went to the cooks, the signallers, the medics, the chaplains, and the helicopter crews. At peak, 400 personnel lived inside the perimeter at any given moment. The gym was small. The library had 2 computer terminals. The mess room had a pool table and a slot machine. The NAFI sold cigarettes, magazines and tea bags, and every single thing on every single shelf had been flown in. By the end of 1976, the mill at Bessbrook had become the single most important piece of military real estate in Northern Ireland. And in the spring of 1977, into the officers' accommodation in the old mill manager's house, came the man whose name the audience has been waiting to hear. Captain Robert Lawrence Nayrac of the Grenadier Guards. Born in Mauritius on the 31st of August 1948, educated at Ampleforth and at Lincoln College, Oxford, where he read modern history. 4 tours of Northern Ireland, 28 months of service in the province. By the spring of 1977, on his 4th tour, he had been seconded to the Army's liaison cell at Bessbrook Mill, working between the resident SAS squadron, the 14 Intelligence Detachment, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary's Special Branch. His commanding officer in the operations cell was Captain David Allen Collett, ex-Parachute Regiment, whose name appears in the published record because Collett was the officer who signed Nayrac out of the gate at 21:25 hours on the night of the 14th of May 1977, and who logged him as expected back by 23:30. Nayrac drove south out of the gate that night in an unmarked car. He had told no one in the operations cell where he was going. He did not return. The 3 Steps Inn at Drummintee is 6 miles from the perimeter of Bessbrook Mill. The men who took him out of it that night did not come from inside the wire. They came from across the border. And the George Cross, gazetted in his name on the 13th of February 1979, still does not say where his body was buried. What no record has ever made public is the exact room in the old mill manager's house where Nayrak slept on his last night. That, however, is one of 2 stories about Bessbrook Mill that the channel has been told the audience wants the rest of. The other story belongs to the men and women whose unit name nobody at the Ministry of Defence has ever printed on a recruiting poster. 14 Intelligence Company, the DET, had been operating in the province since 1973. From the day of its formation, it had recruited women. It was the first time a unit inside the United Kingdom's Special Forces architecture had done so. The women who passed selection were valued for what their male counterparts could not do. Enter Republican social spaces without triggering surveillance. Sit alone in pubs. Sit alone in cars. Sit alone in waiting rooms in Belfast hospitals without the kind of attention a male operator would attract. Their cover stories were built around civilian roles. They moved in and out of South Armagh through cover identities that the unit's veterans have, in the published memoirs, described as a network of trusted civilian fronts, though the specifics of which civilian institutions cooperated and which did not remain in the open record unconfirmed. What the open record establishes beyond doubt is that the South Detachment of 14 Intelligence Company operated forward from Bessbrook Mill, and that the operations they ran from there over 24 years are the single longest covert surveillance campaign in British military history. After 14 Int came the Force Research Unit. The FRU was established in 1980 under the authority of the Director of Military Intelligence. Its headquarters was at Lisburn, but it ran 4 regional detachments: North, East, West and South, and the Southern Detachment ran out of Bessbrook. Its function was not surveillance. Its function was the recruitment, running and care of human informants inside the paramilitary organisations. The names of the FRU handlers at Bessbrook have never been formally released. The names of the agents they ran have, in important cases, never been released either. What is known is the architecture. What is known is that by the late 1980s, every IRA active service unit operating south of the railway line between Newry and Portadown was being watched, at some level, by some part of the apparatus that lived inside Bessbrook Mill. Robert Nayrak's bunk at Bessbrook was on the 2nd floor of the old mill manager's house. The bunk above his is now in a Royal Logistic Corps museum. Nobody who lived inside the wire at Bessbrook in those years lived without the knowledge that the South Armagh Brigade was watching the wire. The IRA never stormed the mill. They never tried. What they did instead, year after year, was attempt to attrit it from outside the perimeter. The first major loss came on the 17th of February 1978. An Army Air Corps Gazelle helicopter, serial number XX404, lifted off the Bessbrook Helipad to support a Royal Green Jackets foot patrol in contact with an IRA unit near Jonesborough. On board the Gazelle was Lieutenant Colonel Ian Douglas Corden Lloyd, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion Royal Green Jackets, one of the most senior British officers ever to deploy on Operation Banner. The pilot took the aircraft in low over the contact zone to assess the ground, took ground fire from the IRA unit, executed a torque turn to evade, stalled the tail rotor and crashed. Corden Lloyd was taken down. The Ministry of Defence reported the crash for many years as a pilot error accident. The file, released decades later through the Freedom of Information process, records the truth. The Gazelle came down, trying to avoid IRA gunfire. Lieutenant Colonel Cordon Lloyd was one of the highest-ranking British officers took down in the entire Troubles. The aircraft that carried him to his death had taken off from Bessbrook. What is striking, looking back through the contact log of the mill, is that no helicopter was ever destroyed by the IRA on the Bessbrook helipad itself. The brigade tried. On the 23rd of June 1985, an RAF Wessex landing at Crossmaglen, 12 miles southwest of Bessbrook, was bracketed by a 4-round IRA mortar pattern. 3 of the 4 mortar devices detonated within 50 metres of the aircraft. The Wessex took shrapnel through the cockpit glass. It did not catch fire. It lifted off again, flew low across the border country, and put down inside the Bessbrook wire 7 minutes later. The aircraft was repaired and flew again the following month. The first IRA confirmed destruction of a British military helicopter in Northern Ireland would not come until the 23rd of June 1988, when an Army Air Corps Lynx was shot down by sustained heavy machine gun fire near Aughanduff Mountain, 12 miles from Bessbrook. The first IRA mortar destruction of a helicopter on the ground came on the 19th of March 1994 at Crossmaglen, where a Lynx was struck by a mortar device on the helipad and burnt out. 4 months later, on the 12th of July 1994, an RAF Puma was brought down by mortar fire over Newtown Hamilton. Inside the Bessbrook wire, the count of British soldiers who died on or from the mill is longer than the public record acknowledges. Gunner Oldfield of 94 New Zealand Battery, the Royal Artillery, was taken down at Bessbrook on the 1st of June 1992, a name that today appears only on a small plaque inside the grounds. Lance Corporal Simon Ware of the 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards, 22 years old, was taken down on the 15th of August 1991, call sign Yankee 10 Bravo, when a 300-pound device buried in the bank of a forest firebreak at Carrick Ravadi detonated under his foot. His patrol had launched from the Bessbrook helipad 2 days earlier. His brother Darren, then a section commander in the Royal Green Jackets, later wrote the only published memoir of that patrol, A Rendezvous with the Enemy, published in 2010. The book describes a brother's loss in the language a brother chooses. The dust jacket carries the Coldstream Guards motto, Nulli secundus, second to none. The last British soldier took down in the Troubles was taken down at Bessbrook. Lance Bombardier Stephen Restorick was 23 years old. He was serving with the 3rd Regiment Royal Horse Artillery. On the 12th of February 1997, he was manning a vehicle checkpoint on the Newry road just outside the Bessbrook perimeter wire. At 16 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, a single 50 caliber round fired from a Barrett rifle at a distance of 250 metres struck him through the upper chest. He died at the checkpoint. The rifle was held by a man called Bernard McGinn. McGinn was one of 2 volunteers of what the security forces had taken to calling the South Armagh Sniper Team. Between 1990 and 1997, the team had taken down 7 soldiers and 2 police officers. Restorick was the 9th. He was also the last. On the 10th of April 1997, a Special Air Service troop launched out of Bessbrook to a farm near Crossmaglen and arrested McGinn and the rest of the sniper team in the act of preparing the next attack. Restorick's mother, Rita, became a peace activist after his death and wrote the only first-person book the family of a British soldier took down at Bessbrook has ever published. It opens with the moment the doorbell rang at her home in Peterborough. It does not soften. Every SAS contact in East Tyrone between 1987 and 1997 was launched from Bessbrook Mill, 4 miles outside Newry. This is the part the wider literature treats too quickly. The mill was not just a heliport, it was the operational forward base. The operations that the Channel's audience has come to know by single-word place names, Loch Gall, Drumnachilly, Cove, Clonoe, were not freestanding incidents. They were sorties out of Bessbrook. On the night of the 7th of May 1987, the Special Air Service troop that would, the following day, end the lives of the 8 men of the East Tyrone Brigade's most experienced active service unit and 1 civilian named Anthony Hughes, flew out of Bessbrook in 2 Wessex helicopters and inserted into the fields around the RUC station at Loch Gall under cover of darkness. 4 years later, on the 3rd of June 1991, the SAS team that took down 3 more East Tyrone Brigade volunteers at Cogue, Lawrence McNally, Tony Dorris, Michael Ryan, staged from Bessbrook. 8 months after that, on the 16th of February 1992, the 12-man SAS team that ended 4 further East Tyrone volunteers at Clonoe, Kevin O'Donnell, Sean O'Farrell, Patrick Vincent, Peter Clancy, staged from Bessbrook. Loch Gall, Cogue, Clonoe, Drumnachilly, Birches. The standing tasking that brought the SAS troop out of barracks at short notice for every one of those contacts was a standing tasking that ran out of the operations cell on the first floor of the old mill building. And the helicopter that lifted them in, and the helicopter that lifted them out, and the helicopter that lifted the wounded and the dead, all came off the same flat slab of concrete behind the perimeter wall. The legal status of some of those contacts is now, 3 decades later, the active subject of inquest proceedings before the Coroner's Court of Northern Ireland. The Humphreys ruling of February 2025 found that the use of force at Clonoe was not legally justified. A separate ruling on Cogue, delivered in 2025, made comparable findings. The record on Loch Gall remains contested, and a fresh inquest is now underway following the Dillon judgment of the Court of Appeal in September 2024. None of this is settled. The script that records it should not pretend otherwise. What is settled, beyond any reasonable historical dispute, is the operational chain. The chain ran from a special branch source, through a special branch handler, into the operations cell at Bessbrook, into a squadron briefing room behind the old mill walls, onto a Bessbrook helipad in the dark, into a Wessex or a Puma or a Lynx, and out across the border country to the contact ground. Every link in that chain has been documented. The first link, the source, has never been named in open court. By the spring of 2007, the British government had decided the chain was finished. The Belfast Agreement of 1998 had held. The Provisional IRA had declared the armed campaign at an end in July of 2005. The Northern Ireland Assembly was sitting at Stormont. The threat assessment for South Armagh had been formally downgraded. Operation Banner, the longest continuous deployment in British military history, 38 years old that summer, was to be wound down by the end of July. The order in which the South Armagh bases closed was deliberate. Falkhill went first, in the spring of 2007. Crossmaglen went next. Bessbrook came last. The Royal Engineers spent 3 months dismantling the 4 Sanger watchtowers. The helipad was cleared of fuel bladders and fire suppression equipment. The accommodation blocks were stripped. The operations cell on the first floor of the old mill building was emptied of its filing cabinets, its safes, its maps, and its lists. On the morning of the 25th of June 2007, at 9 o'clock, 20 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, under the command of Colonel Wayne Harbour, walked through the gate, locked it behind them, and boarded the last helicopter to lift off the Bessbrook helipad. Colonel Harbour called it a final act in the longest military campaign in the Army's history. He said the Army was pleased to be going and that the peace process was progressing. He said that soldiers, more than anybody else, understood the importance of peace. The helicopter lifted into a low summer haze and turned west. Operation Banner formally ended 36 days later, on the 31st of July. In the years that followed, the mill itself fell silent. The wire was cut down in 2009. The 4 Sangar towers came down the same year. The Royal Logistic Corps Association placed a brass plaque inside the old mill manager's house in 2011. It names 19 soldiers who died on Operation Banner from injuries sustained on the helipad or at the mill perimeter. The names on the plaque do not name the 14 intelligence company operators who lived in the annex. The names on the plaque do not name the FRU handlers who ran their networks out of the back wing. The names on the plaque do not name the Special Reconnaissance Wing presence, whose specific deployments have, to this day, never been declassified. The plaque names what can be named. What cannot be named is not named. The mill at Bessbrook is empty now. The wire is down. The helipad is a flat slab of grass and concrete that local farmers use to dry hay on in late summer. The 4 Sangar towers came down in 2009. The Royal Logistic Corps Association placed a brass plaque inside the old mill manager's house in 2011. It names 19 soldiers who died on Operation Banner from injuries sustained on the helipad or at the mill perimeter. It does not name the 14 intelligence company operators who lived there. It does not name the FRU handlers who ran their networks out of the back annex. It does not name the 18 years' worth of SAS troopers who flew in, rotated out, and never came back. There is no plaque for them. There is no monument. There is, for now, just an empty linen mill 4 miles outside Newry, with a helipad still visible from the air.